Hello, good friends from Falmouth and parts far and near. I'm Will Mebane, one of the co-hosts for The Conversation here on FCTV, and I'm delighted that you've made the time to join us for this 22nd episode of The Conversation. As always, I'm joined by my friend, my mentor, my inspiration, uh, Onjalé Scott Price. Angie, good to see you. Haven't seen you in a while because we've both been doing vacation stuff. So good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, Rev.
What a show we have for our folks today. We are going to be examining a topic that is very much in the news these days, which is what we try to do here on the conversation, doing things that are topical. The topic is the climate change, climate crisis, climate emergency that we're facing, with a particular focus on the role that racism plays in the climate crisis. And so we have, as usual, some folks on the street, and we've asked to respond to a couple of questions. And one of the questions is, what role does racism play in the effects, or the efforts rather, to address the climate crisis? So what role does racism play in efforts to address the climate crisis? We're going to take a minute now or two to listen to what they have to say in response to that question, and then we'll be back with some very impressive guests to join us in the studio to continue the conversation and responding to that question. So we'll be back just in a moment.
So obviously climate change impacts every part of our lives, and so does racism. There is a huge intersection between the two, driven mostly by historical inequities that exacerbate climate impacts on Black and brown communities. Redlining, housing discrimination, the concept of sacrifice zones, having Black and brown communities co-located with industrial areas, those have led to huge disparities in not just environmental experience, but life outcomes between races. Furthermore, there's a wealth gap in the US, and lower income households would be less capable of dealing with the effects of climate change. There's Climate change is exacerbating and leading to stronger and more frequent natural disasters. We're more impacted by megastorms, hurricanes, tornadoes, things like that. And so the ability to rebuild or to move out of an area that is impacted by those types of storms completely depends on a person's financial resources. And historical disparities and also modern systemic racism have led to disparate outcomes between white people and Black and brown people. So having different resources creates differential impacts of climate change on those communities. There's a lot of intersection between the two of them.
I've actually spent a fair amount of work looking into the connections between racism and the climate crisis. And I've come to learn that they're actually both caused by the same root cause, which is, I guess the simplest way to put it, is treating people and places and nature like resources for our consumption. And it can be a lot to get into, but overconsumption of our resources leads to climate change and other problems, poverty, really awful things like slavery. And we're all basically good people. So we have to have some kind of ideology to let us do these things. And that's where racism comes in, and other things too, like imperialism, to help explain why we should do this. So that's useful for a couple of reasons. And that's if racism and climate change are both caused by the consumption of resources, then that informs the solution, and it also lets us work together at the root cause of the problem.
Well, I think our people on the street have gotten us off to a very good start in addressing the question, What role does racism play in efforts to address the climate crisis? And we're now joined by two distinguished individuals who are part of our scientific community here in Woods Hole to help us continue the conversation around that topic. And welcome to both David and to Rob. And I'm going to start with David, if I can, and ask you to respond to the question or what you heard our people on the street say. And first, I guess I should offer a little introduction of David. I love your title. It's like as long as all the titles I've ever had in my life, all put together in one, right? So David Mark Welch is a senior scientist and director of the Josephine Bay Paul Center for Comparative Molecular Biology and Evolution, whatever that is. You can teach me that, perhaps as we move through the show. And he's also involved with an organization called the Falmouth Climate Action Network. And so we're delighted to have you with us, David. What's your reaction to the question? What's your response to the question of what our guest had to say?
I mean, it's interesting. I guess I think of it as a two-part answer to those. I mean, there's two issues. One, the relationship between sort of our long history of racism and the climate crisis, in that the climate crisis is sort of one of the most intersectional issues that we have because it affects everything that we're doing. And it, in turn, the root causes of, in my opinion, the root causes of the climate crisis are the same as the root causes of our sort of racial, economic, and social inequity. Basically, the extraction economy, capitalism, individualism, in a word, greed, right? Same root causes that led to slavery and the indigenous genocide and ongoing institutional racism, in my opinion. You look at, as the climate crisis intensifies, who is most affected by the extremes, flooding, storms, drought, heat. That is primarily going to be, Black, Indigenous people of color, who has access to the resources and services to lighten that burden. That's primarily upper middle class white people, right? So there are racism issues right there in the way the climate crisis affects everyone. And then, that was my thoughts based on what our interviews. When I first read the question, I had another thought, which is, to what degree are the climate solutions that we're pursuing now themselves somewhat racist? Which I know that there has been, a lot written about, and a concern that much of the work addressing the climate crisis is on, in my opinion, the symptoms and not the root causes. We're not really looking at the root causes of the problems of the extraction economy. We're saying, how can we find technological fixes that will, allow us to maintain the sociological status quo, right? How can we green the economy to reduce the amount of carbon that we're emitting without having to make any kind of personal sacrifices? But there will be sacrifices made as we do that. We're going to be extracting new resources. Where is that extraction going to come from? Historically, it comes from areas where marginalized people are. Are we increasing sacrifice zones and things like that? I look at the decisions that we are making, and this is broad generalization, I'm ignoring some other things, but to make my point, we are investing in charging stations for electric vehicles. We're not investing in public transportation. So who are we helping when the average cost of an EV is $60,000 or more? We're talking about batteries for our homes to protect us against, power outages and things like that. We're not talking about microgrids for the community. We're talking about land going to private solar development. We're not talking about community solar. So I think that issues like that also, I think there's a racial justice and social justice component to how we approach the solutions of climate change.
Well, you've already educated me and caused me to rethink some things because I had this idea of maybe putting some EV charging stations around the campus here at St. Barnabas's, right? Thinking that, oh, that would be a great way to make a statement about how conscious we are about the environment and wanting to care for creation, but I'm going to rethink that.
Well, don't not do it, but maybe we should also be like, improving the service of the Wish trolley or the, Cape Cod trolley service around. So
Right. Well, thank you. And I
do have a plug-in hybrid, so I don't, please go ahead and put another. I would enjoy a charging station at St. Barnabas. That would be very handy.
Okay, all right. And I guess I should have said, as I was distracted by your very long title, that you're with the Marine Biological Laboratory.
Right, yes. The Bay Paul Center is within the Marine Biological Laboratory.
Right. So, Rob, let's bring you into the conversation as well. And I love how David's gotten us started with a particularly focus on the efforts that are underway to address the climate crisis. I guess I should have said from the beginning, or just hopefully got an agreement that there's no disagreement among any of us that we do have a climate crisis. Yes, we have a climate crisis.
No disagreement here.
Right. So we can dispense with trying to articulate the reasons why we think we know that it's been described as climate change and, climate emergency and climate crisis. So we know that there is a crisis here. So, Rob, you are also part of the scientific community here in Falmouth, serving as Center Director at the Woods Hole Coastal and Marine Science Center, and also serving as the Diversity and Inclusion Change Agent for the U.S. Geological Survey. So give us your initial thoughts.
Well, I think David captured, so many of the macro issues really, really well. And it's, what he described as, what we have chosen to focus on. Are we looking back? Are we stepping back far enough? The issue with, chargers versus, the one I immediately remember is, private solar versus community solar and things like that. It's very clear that systemic racism has played a significant role, as we saw in the lead-up segments, in access and the disproportionate impacts and the representation. And you have here two scientists who have worked together a lot. And a third member of our community that is addressing this in the STEM field is Anji, and increasing representation in dealing with the problem and understanding it. As scientific institutions, we don't have historically good representation across lived experiences and racial and ethnic backgrounds and things like that. And it's a fundamental problem. And, one of your other programs talked about diversity in STEM. That is a really major problem because you don't have the people at the table doing the research, setting the research agenda, communicating the results that are, products of those impacts, that have unique perspectives on those impacts. And it sometimes guides decisions to, the kinds of resource extraction issues, the impact issues, all the things that David mentioned. As a member of the executive branch of the federal government, we recognize this through our Title VI Civil Rights Act responsibilities. That's where we, that is how we enter this part of the conversation.
So what is Title VI? Tell us a little bit more about what that is and the requirements under which you operate.
Title VI, which is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is, the government's point of entry into, the legal requirements of, being sure that we combat racism and by extension, environmental justice issues that also now relate to the climate crisis. And this is a fundamental part of several of the executive orders that President Biden signed that are now part of the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to combating both systemic racism and its impacts, and also addressing the climate crisis.
Thank you for that. So I know, Anji, as Rob mentioned, you are also part of the scientific community in Woods Hole there, and have been working to try to help diversify at all levels, I guess, scientists that work in those fields. You have a follow-up question, maybe?
So I did, but I first wanted to just circle back to what David said. You mentioned sacrifice zones, and I'm not sure that our audience will know what that is. I'm somewhat familiar with it, but could you talk a little bit about sacrifice zones and what those are?
So I'm by no means an expert. But at least what I meant by the term is, areas of our country that are, so polluted and so prone to high rates of cancer and asthma and other sorts of problems that, in a sense, we've given up as a country and just said, this is the cost of doing business, that we are going to have communities like this in order for the rest of us to have all the things that we want. And it's not my term. Somebody else came up with this concept of the sacrifice zone. And as we go away from, a petroleum-based economy, there's still going to be extraction in order to meet all of our needs. Those sacrifice zones aren't going to go away without major socioeconomic change, which I guess is the second part of our conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you for just clarifying that. My understanding of them is pretty much what you said. And adding on to that, that's why we need to have different representation at the table as we work through these challenges, because those sacrifice zones are generally in poor neighborhoods, Black and brown neighborhoods, or that's what those neighborhoods become. They become sacrifice zones by nature of not having the resources put into them, not having the care. And then if we don't have people who are either from those communities or ones who want to represent those communities at the table while we're making these decisions, those sacrifice zones, it's going to be easy to say, well, they're already a sacrifice zone, so let's just make them bigger, instead of how do we reduce harm in these sacrifice zones as we move forward with our plan. And I think you made a really interesting point about the individualism that has brought us to where we are. And similar to Reverend Will, I've thought the town should definitely put in more EV charging stations. And again, there's nothing wrong with those. People do have hybrid electric vehicles, but really we're treating the symptoms and not the root causes. And I thought that was a really fantastic point that I had not even considered myself. So, yeah.
I can get more radical if you want, but that's.
I love radical. I just said recently when talking about affordable housing, I said, that's my new term. We got to do something radical, and we have to do something radical for the climate crisis as well.
I was recalling an article I saw that was published, I think, by Sierra, the magazine of the Sierra Club, and the title was "Racism is Killing the Planet."
Yeah.
The ideology of white supremacy leads the way toward disposable people and a disposable natural world. And one of the quotes from that article is, you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. And you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism.
That's deep.
That ties it all together right there.
Right. That's an excellent article that I keep bookmarked for easy access. Now, our folks on the street, Kirstin and Bette, really also spoke to this issue, and I especially appreciated Kirstin talking about the historical inequities that just exist in our society, right? We know, again, I'm assuming we can all agree that racism exists, and it exists in every corner of our society. And so why should there be any question that the racism would be prevalent in both contributing to the climate crisis and efforts to mitigate rather the crisis. And she talked a lot. Kirstin especially talked about the wealth gap, and I can't remember if it was David or Rob that spoke to this. Is that this wealth gap, this inequity that we have in society in our country, is a continuing contributing factor to the perpetuation of systemic racism. I wonder if either of you has a thought or a response to that.
Yes. It's something that, certainly, I think have come up in conversations that Rob and I have had, around the Woods Hole Diversity Initiative and others, and I'm sure Anji's been involved in this as well. It maintains the status quo, right?
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to get at is so how does it manifest itself? So if we know that, we know there's disparity, there's a wealth gap. How do we see that? Where is that shown? How does that manifest in our everyday lives? Something our viewers can relate to. Yeah, go ahead.
So we know that sea level rise is going to affect coastal communities, but in wealthy places like here in Falmouth, people just build seawalls so that their properties aren't affected. They can still enjoy their beach and whatever. Whereas in communities where people don't have the resources and the financial ability to build seawalls or even potentially to move, they have to deal with whatever comes. Whereas again, people here or in other wealthy communities could build seawalls or they could move. And there's also thinking about natural disasters is how quickly and how much can you recover from a natural disaster. Often, I remember Hurricane Katrina. I was in Florida at the time, and I remember other students saying, well, why didn't people just leave? And I remember thinking why didn't people just leave? And realizing some people can't leave. Some people can't afford to leave. Some people don't have the mobility to leave. And those are not generally people who are in wealthy communities or people who have those resources. And so people are going to be subject to what harm comes from climate change because they don't have anywhere to go or they don't have the means to go anywhere else.
That's a really great point. I'm reminded of a number of studies and media coverage of those studies that talked about low-lying areas in South Florida, in Miami, in the suburbs. Some of the highest ground that is, in a relative term, down in Miami, that is least vulnerable to sea level rise and its associated impacts, is currently occupied by people, communities of color that have been there for a very long time, but they are being priced out and moved out by wealthier interests that are coming in because it's the high ground and it's available. And this is a community that is vulnerable to being bought out, moved out, and a lot of places, to Anji's point, those residents may not have a place to go. Their employment is based geographically. For example, and for better or for worse, as a scientist, I tend to adopt what is the scientific process for looking at this? And it's been heartening to see a lot of new things coming online that allow us to at least quantify it. A lot of this existed. There were a number of state studies done, back when the original environmental justice executive order was issued by President Clinton in 1994. It was delegated to the states, and EPA had most of the federal role in this. The Biden-Harris administration has made this explicitly an all of government responsibility to identify, quantify, and begin to address areas where we see environmental justice. And there's a new online screening tool that takes a number of metrics about socioeconomic wealth and a number of things that David mentioned in his opening. and puts them on a map so that you can see where are these communities and what is the nature of that injustice. Is it poor air quality? Is it flooding or sea level rise hazards? And what resources do they need? And how might the federal government, at least in its role, begin to address this? And how might other groups, faith groups, NGOs, everybody? And it's basically, it's shining a broader and more consistent light on what could, or what has long existed in small pockets that are, easier to not pay attention to, or say, well, this is just one little thing. But when you roll it all up in that picture, I think you get a more holistic view, and then you can start to address those things with, where needed, radical solutions, to use Anji's term, because we're going to have to really push, the edges of the envelope and look out of the box to really get at this at the kind of scale and with the kind of equity that are certainly priorities that have been set by this administration and the various organizations that are paying attention to this issue.
I think that's a great point, because the disparity between the investments that are made in different kinds of communities. Anji mentioned sort of wealthy seaside communities. They don't ever seem to have much trouble rebuilding after a storm, whereas there are parts of Louisiana that are still rebuilding after multiple hurricanes ago. And one thing about climate change is it's just going to put an incredible amount of stress on all aspects of our infrastructure. And all of the decades of underspending on infrastructure in poorer regions is going to come back to haunt us. And you look at things like water in Jackson, right? That's not directly climate change, but it's part of the overall stress that's been put on our system. And it's places like Jackson, Mississippi that are having the, collapse of their water system. It's not, I don't know of higher income places in Mississippi, but it's not it's the place where there are more Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It's not the wealthier areas that are having that problem.
Yeah, Jackson is, I think, that 80% Black.
Yeah.
So it's not happening in the communities that are probably 80%
right.
White.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This whole discussion now is reminding me and getting my blood to boil a little bit when I think about the insidiousness of racism, that it just permeates everything. Before we scheduled this this conversation, I'd had some exposure, as I mentioned, the article I read about racism is killing the planet, but I had never really thought too much about the role of racism in causing climate change or this effect or mitigating the crisis. And Rob, when you were talking about what's happening in Miami, where I guess it's a new form of gentrification, right? That so you got Black and brown people living on the higher ground, and so they will be safer, theoretically, from the drastic impacts of natural disasters from water and wind, but now being displaced by white folk who are more threatened. And I just, I never heard that, never thought about that. And again, it just reminds me of the insidiousness of racism in our society. One of the things Bette said in her comment was that treating people and the climate like, I think she said resources, is one of the causes that as disposable. Just people are sort of like the quote from the article. Certain people are just disposable, but then she followed that by saying that we're basically good people, right? But that we get, these are my words, not hers, we get indoctrinated by racism. People who tune into this show regularly have heard me say ad nauseum, racism is taught. It's not something that anyone is born with and understanding of. And then the system of which we are part, this sort of an imperial system, this capitalist system, just perpetuates that racism. So, any thoughts from either one of you about that?
I think she's
David has
right.
been setting the tone here, so I will let him lead.
I think she's absolutely right, and I think David kind of hit on that a little bit earlier. As long as we continue to look at everything as a resource to be consumed, we're just going to continue down this path. And so we have to make a radical decision to not treat people and the planet as a resource to be consumed, rather a resource to be enjoyed and to be shared and to be loved and all those nice things. But that's going to take a radical mindset shift of us as people, and then changing our institutions. So I'm going to go back to the EV charging thing, because that was is a brilliant point. Yes, we do need those because those are good and might incentivize people to get them. But that is not actually dealing with the root of the problem. And that is very individualized. That is very imperialistic thinking, instead of how can we move more people? How can we make it more accessible? How can we make it more affordable? So, I mean, I have to admit, even that's not the way that I was thinking about it. And I'm supposed to be working towards these issues, right? So I still have a lot to learn and a lot of thinking to change. And so I think everybody else does too.
I mean, the climate changes are the immediate crisis that's upon us because it's being thrust upon us, and it can have catastrophic effects, and it likely will have catastrophic effects. But it's part of this broader Anthropocene intervention that we are making in the natural world, right? And if we suddenly switch from extracting petroleum to extracting lithium, it's not going to change that much in terms of the damage that we're doing to the planet and that we're doing to each other, and the need to maintain the same sort of economic system that's based on, as Reverend Will said, and I can't remember your exact words, but from the article that you had read about racism is killing the planet, that there must be people at the bottom in order to make this system work.
Yeah, disposable people.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe we can, I want to get to the second question here in a moment, but I want to bring this home a little bit. I want to bring it closer to home. And David, I know you're involved with the Falmouth Climate Action Network. I think I have that right. And so tell us a little bit about the sorts of things that you and those involved in the organization with you. What sort of things are you all trying to get folks to do here in Falmouth?
So the Falmouth Climate Action Network is just a volunteer group of concerned people who are trying to figure out what they as individuals can do about the climate crisis on a local level. It's part of a broader, the Climate Action Network concept extends from communities all the way up to an international level. I'm not sure how effectively it extends up that way, but there are multiple towns on Cape Cod that have climate action networks. And then there's a Cape Cod Climate Action Network, and it's associated with the Massachusetts Climate Action Network, which is associated with the U.S. Climate Action Network. So local grassroots organizations that are sort of tied together through this structure. And we've been, we're trying to, certainly educate the community through webinars and seminars, book clubs, make people more aware of the climate crisis, but then trying to influence the town to take it seriously, right? Because everybody in town leadership recognizes that there is a climate crisis, but recognizing that means that immediate action is necessary, even though there are all sorts of other pressing needs on the town and town officials and other things that we have to deal with. But so we've been involved in the various solar farm proposals that have come up to the town and trying to weigh the costs and benefits between clearing trees to put up solar. That's a very deep question that's practically a whole nother program, but how you find the balance there. We've been pushing for the town to hire a sustainability director to focus directly on the climate crisis so that various aspects of what the town is doing can be coordinated through sort of a single person whose writ is to focus on climate change. And it's hard to make those kinds of changes in a town because there are so many other issues that seem to be so pressing. What are we going to do about the beaches? What are we going to do about the schools? What are we going to do about the potholes, kind of thing? And part of what Falcon is trying to say is the town of Falmouth declared a climate emergency a few years ago in a town meeting. And the word emergency has connotations. The word emergency doesn't mean we wait until 2030 to put something into effect because we need to be somewhere by 2040. It means that we start doing things now. So our I guess, long-winded way of saying our main goal is trying to convince the town and the community that we need to start doing things now to address the climate change.
And David, if I remember, your name is one of the petitioners for the article at town meeting.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So
as along with the other sort of the board of the Falmouth Climate Action Network.
Right. I remember I didn't see Falcon's name on it, but I knew everybody was a member of Falcon. And so that's something that we talked about our strategic planning session last Saturday. Was we all agreed that it was a priority. So our next strategic priority session, we're going to be looking at the budget and how to make that and some other things fit into the budget. So thank you guys for pushing us to do that. It is really important, and we do think it's important. And like you said, there are competing priorities, but in a town that has 70 miles of coastline, 90, it really depends on how you calculate it, because I've definitely heard both, but at least 70 miles of coastline, looking at coastal resiliency and sustainability is going to hit us much faster than other places. Not that that minimizes a priority of climate change anywhere else, but, really puts into focus how much time and energy and money we need to be focusing on it now.
Yep.
I think that's part of packaging how we think about this is building it into everything, making it a part, making environmental justice, and referring back to the Sierra article that Reverend Newell mentioned, addressing root causes that include racism and systemic racism and disenfranchisement and lack of representation. When you start building that thinking into everything that you do, these things cease to become distractions or other priorities. They become part of how you have to think about it. And I think that creates a tremendous opportunity for messaging such that everyone has to be involved, everyone will benefit, and just proceed from there. You can't look away from it. You have to look at the whole picture. And yes, there's a lot of very important sub-pictures, but when you start thinking constantly, relentlessly, radically about the comprehensive approach and the consequences of choosing this priority over that priority, and how far does that move you down the road to being a more resilient community, to being a more just and equitable community, then I think you really start to make some headway, and a lot of that clutter goes away. Well, we have to do this to the exclusion of that.
I think another great example of
No, go ahead.
on the local level, these sort of intersectionalities. You think about things like the housing crisis that's facing Falmouth right now. And particularly for low-income housing. Low-income housing can be built with oil heat because that's the cheapest way for the contractors to do it, and that's the cheapest way for the town to get affordable housing. That's not the cheapest energy solution for the people who are then going to be occupying those houses. So if those homes are built with heat pumps rather than oil heat, then that's a better solution for the low-income people who actually have to pay the costs long term. And I know Habitat for Humanity has done a great job of integrating those kinds of things into their house builds. And that's a challenge for Falmouth and for other communities. And I know that Falmouth has done, they've started to look at where are the areas where affordable housing can be built that is a reasonable compromise between overdevelopment on certain kinds of land and the need to put housing in certain areas of high density, and trying to figure out how best to do that. But The housing crisis is a real good example of intersectionality of racism and climate crisis right there.
And to your earlier point, Anji, about coastal processes and the infinite number of miles that is Falmouth coast, right? When you measure around every sand grain, that gets to be a really big number.
Yeah.
But where would that housing be? How close is it to today's 100-year floodplain? How close might it be to the 2030 or 2040 or 2050 100-year floodplain? Because quite often, those are the folks, the folks who are going to be living there do not have the resources. They're not resilient to having their houses' contents washed away or having their car flooded with salt water, things like that. So where on the landscape this goes is going to be just as important as what energy source are they using,
and who gets to be at the table when those decisions are being made.
Yeah.
Well, your mentioning of the flooding is reminding me of the headlines and the news stories that have seemingly been nightly in the last few months about flooding in places like Mississippi and Kentucky and Texas and other places. And it always seems to strike me that when I see those reports, most of the people impacted, not all, but most of the people impacted who are talking about having had their belongings washed away, they tend to be black and brown folks. And they certainly almost always poor folks.
Yep.
So it underscores what we were saying earlier. I want to make sure our viewers of the conversation know what Anji was referencing when she was saying we had a strategic planning session and we are going to be doing this and so you want to explain
Yes,
that?
and actually that gives me a good chance to clarify. We as the Falmouth Select Board, we discussed this. I should be clear, we did not vote anything. I don't want anybody to come after me that I said something that we had not voted on. So we did have a good discussion. We were in agreement. We agreed that we were in agreement that we wanted to move forward with looking at how adding a sustainability director would look in our FY24 budget. So we at the Falmouth Select Board, I can speak on the behalf of that, but we haven't voted anything yet. So stay tuned for what we decide in a couple weeks.
And I was trying to look very hard at Will there while we were having that conversation, and I was not lobbying on you.
It's okay, I can't tell.
Well, listen, it's probably a good time for us to go and listen to and see what our people on the street had to say in response to our second question. And I want to give Rob a heads up that you've mentioned several times environmental justice, and you sent me a communication a couple of months ago where you talked about environmental justice and why it was important to attend to that. So I'm going to come back and ask you a question about that. But right now, let's take a look at the other clip of our people on the street who are going to be responding to the question: what steps are necessary to ensure environmental justice? What steps are necessary to ensure environmental justice? Let's see what Kirstin and Bette had to say.
First thing I want to say, it gets tricky now because climate change at this point is a true emergency. And so the future and justice are not ensured for any of us. But as we go forward into solutions to address both these, it's important to keep life as the focus, to treat people and nature well and care for each other, and to really vet solutions that we would go into through that lens. I've learned there are 3 questions you can ask to ensure justice is being addressed in any policy or plan, and that's who pays, who benefits, and who decides. And those can be simple questions, but to really dig into the answers is more complicated, because who pays and who benefits includes money, but doesn't stop at money. It could be the trees giving their lives. It could be who's currently suffering from the system we have, and could a change benefit them? And so it can be pretty complicated, but it's definitely worth doing. And I think that's the way to ensure justice is done for both people and the planet.
First of all, I'm not going to claim to have the complete answer. And obviously, I have no lived experience of systemic racism as it affects Black and brown people in the United States. I've lived as a white woman, so that is my experience. But in my view, I think that having financial mechanisms to address the historical and modern systemic disparities that lead to disparate outcomes in wealth distribution between races, that's absolutely necessary. And yes, I am talking about reparations, because there is no way that we will enable people to cope with climate change in an effective way unless we go back and address the problems that we've created that have led to some people being more impacted by climate change than others. There's a lot of organizations, I think, that have an environmental focus and strongly white membership, which doesn't necessarily speak to white people being more interested in environmental causes. It may speak more to their voices being more readily accepted or heard, and including the voices of people who are more severely impacted by climate is actually a very important part of shaping environmental policy going forward.
Well, once again, both Bette and Kirstin have given us much to think about. For our in-studio panelists to chew on, Rob Thieler and David Mark Welch. So I want to hear what they have to say in response to the question, what steps are necessary to ensure environmental justice. But Rob and I had an opportunity to have a little exchange via email a few weeks ago, and in that he raised the whole issue, a question of environmental justice. And one of the things I remember Rob saying is that environmental justice and equity benefits everyone. Everyone benefits from it. And that approaching science through an environmental justice lens can help support underserved communities in yielding positive outcomes, help make science better, more inclusive, and more actionable. That really caught my eye, Rob, and I want to give you a moment to say more about that, if you would.
Sure, happy to. And hopefully at the end, I'll be able to tie it back to the work that Anji and David and I have done as part of the Woods Hole Diversity Initiative and the Diversity Advisory Committee. It was fascinating when I got that email from them. I said, oh, here is a really interesting opportunity to talk about how, at least, my professional perception of this really relates. And I recall making a couple of points. One is that you were on, and you had asked me a few questions about how to frame my, to help me frame my response. One is, as we talked at the head of the program, the science on climate change is clear. It is publicly accessible. It is well documented. Everyone has access to all the same data. We do, as a scientific community, continue to improve our understanding of the impacts and the consequences of climate change, many of which we've discussed so far during this discussion. And we have a much better understanding of the benefits and the costs of the societal responses, and the need to start thinking more holistically about this, because it'll take everybody and it benefits everybody. And where I was coming from with approaching science through an EJ, environmental justice lens, really comes from the environmental justice. What is environmental justice? It's a vision for a better future, where everybody enjoys equal protection from environmental harm, equal access to healthy environments and environmental resources and the benefits of them, whether they're extractive, renewable, whatever. And has meaningful participation in environmental governance, and management and decision making. And the world we have right now is characterized by environmental injustice, certain groups, as we've discussed, have borne and continue to bear a disproportionate burden of the harm, do not enjoy the same resources and benefits, or are not heard in the decision-making process through structural and systemic barriers that we've talked about. And I think it's, in our little corner of the universe here in Falmouth and Woods Hole, the things that we have been working on in the scientific community around assessing where are we in terms of diversifying STEM, the people who are going to help frame the scientific solutions and the consequences of scientific solutions and the societal impacts of how we do our science and all that has been, I think, a microcosm of this larger conversation. And it started, with the science institution leaders back in 2004 agreeing that there was a real problem in diversity in STEM and representation that was compromising the quality, depth, and impact of our science. And we needed to address that. And we began to work together, all 6 Woods Hole science institutions, on building new programs and bringing in people from underrepresented groups and developing educational programs and talent and bringing them back into the Woods Hole community to hopefully be a part, or scattering them like seeds across the country and across the world to carry that message of the importance of earth and ocean science and biological science and all the things that we do here, climate science. And that's been really exciting. And along the way, we took a very hard look back in 2017 at what are the barriers within our community. What is our level of cultural competence? What is the extent or the lack of diversity that impacts us? Where are we experiencing overt racism and microaggressions? How is our community disposed? Are we engageable to address this problem, or are we apathetic, or have we resigned to always being this kind of culture? And the answer in that report was, you can't be. You have to strive for change. And that has helped frame a lot of our thinking, especially in the last couple of years. And I think we've also learned that it's a slow process. As fast as you would like to go, it will never be fast enough. And as thoughtful as you'd like to be, sometimes you just have to take a risk and say, this is going to be a little different, and it's going to challenge a lot of people. And we're going to test it. We are scientists. We test hypotheses all the time. And when they work, we celebrate. And when we don't, we also celebrate, because now it teaches us what we can do now, because we know that didn't work. So we're in this sort of infinite loop of, let's try something and see if we can move the needle in the direction we want it to go. And we've met with some really significant successes over the years. And I think it gives me hope as someone who's part of a larger scientific community, nationally and internationally, that we can get at this.
Yeah, really, you make some really good points there, Rob. When we look at our scientific community within Woods Hole, within Falmouth, we have done a lot of work. We still have, a lot of ways to go. But something you said reminded me that we need to commit to continuing to learn, and learning is what we as scientists like to do. But sometimes we think we know everything about something, and we don't necessarily want to put in work to learn more, or we think that we know enough. And when I was talking about being at school in Florida and Hurricane Katrina coming and destroying many parts of Louisiana and other parts in the South, and me talking to people and thinking like, yeah, why didn't people just move? That was what I knew at the time. That was my thought process then. And I mean, in many ways, I like to think that I've grown and think differently and have learned. And clearly I have, because now I look back on that and think, wow, that was a really dumb thought. Like I was looking at that from my privileged perspective of, I would have just moved, but thinking now like, well, I have those resources. I had that financial ability through my family, and not everyone has that. And so as you made these points about doing the work that we're doing in Woods Hole and hoping, my goal is hoping that all my PEP students come back to Woods Hole, but realistically, them going out into the world and spreading this message is actually just as important, because the work that we do here, we don't want it to just stay here. We want it to broaden the sciences. Broaden within the sciences. We want it to go other places so that other people and other communities are doing the type of work that we're doing to diversify these fields that are going to be doing the research and doing the work about how to mitigate the climate change and the climate crisis that we're in.
Well, David, I know that subject is also very important to you. Diversification, diversity in the STEM field. Anything you want to add to what Anji and Rob have shared?
It's hard to say it better than they have, but I think, I mean, in particular to this question of how are we going to address the changes that are needed in the way that we approach the climate crisis, I think it's absolutely correct. We need more voices at the table. We need more diversity in the organizations that are trying to do something about climate change. And we need more, Black and brown scientists and people who are knowledgeable about climate change. I mean, if not necessarily scientists, I mean, not all of the PEP students are going to go on to scientific careers, which I think is fine, because what we need is more citizens who are highly educated in science. And if these people go into policy, if these people go into city management, if these people go into any of those kinds of fields with the knowledge that they learned being here at Woods Hole, then I think that's a win for everybody. We need more scientific literacy among the people who are trying to figure out what to do about climate change, and even among the people who aren't sure we should be doing anything about climate change.
And just so our viewers know what you mean, PEP is?
Oh, sorry. Another thing I take for granted, the Woods Hole Partnership Education Program. We call it PEP. So Rob mentioned back in 2004, the leaders of the 6 institutions in Woods Hole created the Woods Hole Diversity Initiative, and that's what Rob is currently the chair of, and David sits on that as well. And the Woods Hole Diversity Initiative, in turn, created the Woods Hole Diversity Advisory Committee, which I'm co-chair of, with along with Hauke, who works at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And in 2009, we, even though I wasn't there yet, but I will claim it, we started the PEP internship, and it brings a group of at least about 15 undergraduates to Woods Hole from diverse backgrounds. So we focus on bringing diversity within undergraduates to Woods Hole to do research for the summer. And so this was our first summer back in person after 2 years virtual, and it was amazing. Don't let me go off on a tangent about it, because I love PEP and I love my PEP students, and I'll go on forever about it.
Well, I want to remind our viewers that we did do a show on STEM and racism in STEM, and we had Anji to talk more about PEP. And so if you're interested, you can go to the archives at FCTV or go online and find the conversation on the FCTV YouTube channel, and you'll be able to see that program if you'd like to know more about it. As we wrap up here, I want to just highlight a couple of things that I heard from both Bette and from Kirstin. I think are worth repeating. First of all, Bette said, in this whole concern about the climate crisis, the climate emergency, as a result of the crisis we're in, the emergency we're in, our futures are not assured. And there's no assurance of justice for any of us if we don't pay attention to this crisis we're facing. She also said we need to keep life as the focus. Keep life as a focus. And as a clergy person, a spiritual leader, that certainly spoke to my heart, and my ears perked up. And then we've got to care for one another. And but then she said we've got to ask 3 questions if we want to know who's doing what and how and why, and who to hold accountable for the situation in which we find ourselves. She said, ask these 3 questions: who pays, who benefits, and who decides? And each of you has talked about the need to have more diverse voices, racially and ethnically diverse voices at the table as those decisions are made, as those policies to address, to mitigate, again, the climate emergency, those policies are developed. So I want to give each of you a chance, if you have any last thoughts to offer before we we wrap our program up. Rob, we'll begin with you. Anything you want to add?
How can I follow that? My thought was, what are the centering principles, and what can we agree ought to be the centering principles about how we approach these issues, whether it's systemic and structural racism, environmental justice, and all that. And I think the speakers in the lead up, captured really well. It's life. It's life on the planet. It's life with each other. In a functioning, sustainable society, and the care that we show towards the things that we value.
How about you, David?
So kind of end on maybe a little bit different note. When Rob was talking about increasing diversity in the fields that study climate change, I was reminded that a couple of years ago at the MBL, we had one of our Friday evening speakers, a woman named Ayanna Johnson, who is one, amazing. Yeah, and she is one of the few, Black marine biologists out there. And she gave an absolutely fantastic talk. And because we're all on Zoom, I was able to actually pull something up here while we were on the break. And just pulling this back to the idea of racism, she says, as a marine biologist and policy nerd, building community around climate solutions is my life's work. But I'm also a Black person in the United States of America. I work on one existential crisis, but these days I can't concentrate because of another. And this is from a blog post where she talks about the fact that as a Black woman in America, how much energy she has to spend dealing with racism rather than dealing with the things that she wants to deal with, which in her case is the climate crisis.
As we say in my profession, that'll preach.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anji and I can, I'll speak for Anji. We can relate to that, right, Anji?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not even sure how to follow that, because I feel that on a deep level. So often I wish I could just focus on what my work is and the task at hand, but I can't. I talked about this a little bit after campaigning in Falmouth, is how much time I had to spend defending some things that I am certain, after talking to many other people who ran, they did not have to defend, and spending so much time thinking about not looking like the angry Black woman, not wearing my hair a certain way because that might turn off voters, not talking about specific subjects in a certain way because that would turn off people, when I know my colleagues did not have to think about any of those things. And so and that's just one very small example. So I can relate to that on a very deep note. And I don't know if I have anything else to add after that, because that's real.
Well, that's why we stay in the struggle. And that's why we're grateful to have not just allies, but accomplices in the struggle, accomplices like David Mark Welch from the Marine Biological Laboratory, and Rob Thieler, diversity, inclusion change agent for U.S. Geological Society. We need accomplices like you to join us in this struggle. So thank you, dear viewers, as always, for being with us, and we look forward to having you engage with us in another episode of The Conversation in the weeks to come. For now, on behalf of FCTV, particularly Alan Russell, Debbie Rogers, and of course my co-host Onjalé Scott Price, thank you again. Until the next time.